Howdy folks, hope you've all had a good weekend and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. This episode's going to be a bit awkward for two reasons. The first one, Juicy, my big dumb, she's now, that noise you can hear is her wagging her tail on my keyboard. The tail of course is attached to the rest of her, which has just made itself extremely comfortable on my mouse pad. I keep trying to move the mouse, and she keeps moving herself to sit on it. So, yeah. The other reason today's episode is going to be a bit awkward is I had my COVID vaccination on Saturday, and I'm having a bit of a reaction to it. I feel terrible. My left arm is dead, and I'm coming down with flu symptoms, which I suppose is good. It means I'm showing an autoimmune reaction to the vaccine, which proves that it's working, but hopefully this is only going to last a day or two. That was just the first of two injections. I have to go back in 12 weeks for a booster shot, so if the first one doesn't kill me, they get to have another go 12 weeks from now. In case you're wondering, yes, it was the AstraZeneca vaccine. No, I'm not worried about dying from blood clots. 40 cases and 70 million vaccinations is statistically nothing, regardless of whether or not Twitter are losing their minds over it. So, what shall we talk about this week? I've got an idea. Since story time with Uncle Jingles is quite popular, as is answering questions, why don't I combine both of them into one? Handsome Vine said, "Hey, mighty overlord Sir Jingles." Oh, that must be me. "Best of luck for your COVID jab. I hope you don't get bad vaccination reaction." Yeah, I'm afraid that ship's already sailed. On the other hand, it shows that the vaccination works. Yeah, exactly. A question that came to my mind in today's video, you said that you aren't afraid of heights. That would have been Saturday's Cyberpunk video. Is that true for the real Jingles, or only the in-game one? And did you need to climb any masts or other tall structures in the Navy? I like tall ship sailing, and while climbing up the masts isn't a big deal for me as long as I have a sturdy piece of fixed rigging to stand on, going out onto the yard arms on a relatively loose rope still scares me. Funny you should ask. No, I'm not afraid of heights. I don't actively seek out tall things to stand on the edge of, but if I have to, it's not a huge problem. Except there was one occasion that I can quite clearly remember. It was when I was in the Navy. I was on board HMS Brazen, which was my first ship. We hadn't been long back from the first Gulf War, so, this was a long time ago. And I can't remember the exact occasion, but we had a dress ship one weekend. Now, for those of you who don't know what dressing ship is, whenever you see a ship with lines of bunting and all kinds of flags festooned on them, strung from the forecastle all the way up to the foremast, and then on line from the foremast to the mainmast, and then from the mainmast all the way back down to the jackstaff, at the stern of the ship, that's dressing ship. Like I said, I can't remember what the occasion was, but it needed to be done. All the dressing lines needed to be rigged with all of the flags and the bunting on them, and it had to be done on the weekend, which was not good news for anybody who was on duty that weekend, and of course I was on duty that weekend. Now, it was even worse news for one of the leading radio operators, and I can't remember his name, but he was from Ireland, so his nickname was Paddy, fairly obvious. He wasn't on duty that weekend because the leading radio operators didn't keep duty watches, but somebody had to stay on board to supervise. I couldn't be expected to do the whole thing myself, so he basically got his weekend leave cancelled in order to take charge and direct me while I climbed up the mast and out onto the yard arm and actually rigged the lines. But it is a two-man job, so he had his weekend ruined even though he wasn't on duty. So we connected the first dressing line to the jackstaff right at the front end of the ship on the forecastle, and then took that by hand up to the bridge, out onto the bridge wings, and then aft to the signal deck right at the base of the foremast. Somebody then had to climb all the way up to the top of the foremast and then out onto the yard arm where the dressing line was going to be rigged. Now, for those of you who don't know what exactly that's going to look like, here is a handy visual reference guide for you. This is HMS Cornwall, pennant number F99. It is a Batch 1 Type 22 frigate, exactly the same as HMS Brazen. So we'd already attached the start of the dressing line to the jack staff, which was on the forecastle right here, and then we'd walked it up to the bridge and then aft to the signal deck at the base of the foremast. I then had to climb up the foremast and go out onto this yard arm here. Now before I went up there I had to do this thing that's known as a RADHAZ. It just stands for radiation hazard, because with all of the radars and stuff on the masts, there's all kinds of nasty radiation up there that will basically microwave you alive if you don't switch them all off before you do something silly like climbing up the foremast and going out onto the yard arm. So the plan was to connect the dressing line from the forecastle to this foremast yard arm, and then connect it from the foremast yard arm to the mainmast yard arm, and then from that all the way down back to the ensign staff that was on the back of the flight deck. We didn't get any further than the foremast that day. Now we were alongside in Plymouth at the time. I have had to go out onto the yard arm while we were actually at sea, which is a lot trickier. But on this occasion we were alongside in Plymouth at the naval base in Devonport. So at least the ship wasn't moving around, and it was quite a nice day. Now obviously I can't take the end of the dressing line up the ladder on the inside of the foremast and get that out onto the yard arm, because then the line's going to run from the forecastle up the inside of the foremast, and that's no good. So I took a line up there with me, attached myself to the yard arm with a safety harness, because I'm not bloody stupid, make my way out to the end of the yard arm, and I drop the line down to Paddy, who's standing on the signal deck 50 feet below me, very hungover and unhappy. He's got a hold of the dressing line. I lower the heaving line down to him. He attaches the heaving line to the dressing line. I then pull the heaving line back up with the dressing line on the end of it, detach the heaving line from the dressing line, pass the dressing line through the block and tackle on the yard arm, back down to Paddy on the signal deck. He then grabs a hold of that, so he's now holding the end of the line that's going up to the foremast yard arm, through the block and tackle, and then all the way back down to the forecastle. It's quite heavy, and Paddy is quite hungover. So I'm 50 feet in the air, out on the end of this yard arm, with my head right over the top of this block and tackle through which the line is being run. I start unclipping myself from the safety harness so I can move the connection point further back so that I can make my way back inboard from the end of the yard arm to the foremast and start climbing down. Right before I unclip that safety harness, I suddenly hear this whizzing noise coming from behind me, because I'm now looking inboard and not outboard at the block and tackle that the line's going through at the end of the yard arm. And the whizzing noise that I heard was being caused by the dressing line that I just fed through the block and tackle coming right back up at an extremely high speed. Don't forget, this entire dressing line is fairly heavy duty rope. It's festooned with flags and bunting, and it has to extend the entire length, in fact more, of a Type 22 frigate. Paddy was only holding on to the last 50 feet of it, the distance between me at the end of the yard arm and him 50 feet down below me on the signal deck. All the rest of the weight was busy pulling the line that he'd let go of with no warning, and trying to rejoin the other 200 feet of line, flags and bunting on the other side of the yard arm, leading all the way back down to the forecastle where we'd started. Now that wasn't an ideal situation for me in the split second that I saw this line coming back up to my face, but if not for one thing, it wouldn't have been catastrophic, because it would have just meant that the line went back through the block and tackle, and I'd have to drop the heaving line down and pull it back up and feed it through again. Except for one thing. On the end of the line was this thing called an Inglefield clip, which is basically a solid lump of metal. I'd had to open the block and tackle and in order to feed the dressing line through in the first place, and then close it again afterwards, because the Inglefield clip was too big to feed through. The Inglefield clip was obviously still attached to the line, and it couldn't get through the block and tackle as it came up at a speed of around about Mach 5. Instead, it hit the block, broke it, rebounded, swung the line over the top of the yard arm, and smacked me right in the back of the head with the Inglefield clip. Fortunately, I was wearing a safety helmet, so I wasn't killed, but I was knocked unconscious. Also, fortunately, I hadn't yet unclipped the safety harness in order to re-secure it further down the yard arm and make my way back to the foremast, which was kind of fortunate because it meant that the safety helmet ensured that I didn't have my brains knocked out by this metal Inglefield clip, and the safety harness meant that I didn't, although I would have been unconscious at the time, so I wouldn't have actually felt anything when I fell 50 feet to my death and crashed into a snotty heap on the signal deck, because I was still connected to the safety harness. So that was an interesting way to spend a weekend. They had to call a dockyard rigger to come out and haul me back up because I couldn't climb back up the safety harness to the safety of the yardarm. So, yeah. And despite that, I'm still not afraid of heights. Although to this day I do remain extremely suspicious of hungover Irish leading radio operators. That wasn't the only time Paddy got me into trouble either. Well, actually, technically he didn't get me into trouble, he just nearly killed me. But there was one other occasion where he got me into so much trouble. I'm trying to remember where we were. Oh, it was Portland. Portland's a shithole. It really, really is. It's an even more of a shithole now than it was when the Navy still had a presence there. Portland used to be where Flag Officer Sea training was based. It's long since moved to Plymouth now, and all of the naval facilities in Portland have been shut down, which was real bad news for Portland. Anyway, we're in Portland. I'm still on HMS Brazen for sea training, which is just absolutely horrible. They had you for 8 weeks, and they just tried to break you. Constantly running exercises and surprise inspections, and just it's an utter nightmare. But it's just something that ships have to do before they can be declared operational and deployed anywhere. It's also something that a ship can fail. It doesn't happen very often, but it has happened. And if a ship fails OST, or operational sea training, then they get invited to come back and do the whole thing again. Like I said, it's a bit of a nightmare. Anyway, on those rare occasions when you get any time off, when the ship's alongside on a weekend, for example, if you're not on duty, get off the ship. Because there will be some kind of surprise fire exercise or whatever, and you really don't want to get involved in it when you're off duty. So, while there wasn't an awful lot to do in Portland, other than go to some extremely depressing pubs, just a couple of miles down the seafront from Portland was the town of Weymouth, and Weymouth is actually a great place. So Paddy and I went to Weymouth, along with one of the other guys, I can't remember who, this was like 30 years ago, from the communications department. After a couple of drinks, we decided that we were hungry and we wanted to get some food, and there was this fantastic Indian restaurant whose name I can't remember, and we decided Indian food was absolutely what we wanted. The only problem was that this early in the evening, it was only around 8 PM, Paddy was epically drunk. So we sat down in this restaurant and ordered our food, and the food arrived, and Paddy started rolling his face around in his curry. I'm not making this up, okay? He just dropped his face down into his plate, started rolling it around in his curry, and then, with his face still in the curry, reached across the table, grabbed bits of naan bread and started throwing it around the restaurant. Unsurprisingly, we were asked to leave. The other guy who was with us, whose name I still can't remember, very wisely decided, screw this, and ditched both me and Paddy. I never saw him again until we got back on board, and there he was the next day. I decided that I should probably cut our losses and try to get Paddy back on board in one piece. So I hailed a taxi. The taxi driver took one look at Paddy and said, he's not going to be sick, is he? I assured the driver that Paddy was fine. We got into the cab. There were signs posted inside the cab because, well, the taxi driver had dealt with sailors before, saying that there was a standard charge of £50 to clean the taxi if anybody puked inside it. We must have gone, I don't know, maybe a mile before Paddy, bless his little cotton socks, decided that he actually wasn't quite ready for the curry that he'd mostly worn but had managed to eat some of it, and it all started coming up again. Frantically recognising the signs, I tried to get Paddy's passenger side door window open and his head outside. Of course I failed, and an epic Technicolor yawn erupted all through the inside of the back seat of this taxi. Understandably, the driver was a little upset. He immediately slammed on the brakes and got out. Paddy, because he wasn't so drunk that he couldn't see what was coming, opened his door and ran for it. I couldn't do that because I was sitting on the driver's side. I was sober. I hadn't puked up. Unfortunately for me, the driver didn't really consider this a valid defence, and he drove me straight back to Portland Harbour, dropped me off at the Royal Naval Provost Headquarters, which is the Royal Navy Police, where he demanded that I not only pay the £50 fine, but also clean all of the vomit out of the inside of the back of the cab. My protests to the Royal Navy Provost that this was a gross violation of justice since it hadn't been me, and hang on, if I'm paying him £50 cleaning fee, why am I the one doing the cleaning, fell on deaf ears. So that's how I spent my first Saturday night off during operational sea training in Portland on HMS Brazen in, I think, 1991 and 1992. Of Paddy, of course, there was no sign. When he did make it back on board and I saw him the following morning and demanded he pay up the 50 quid that he had cost me, he just laughed at me. I never did see the money. And I got no sympathy from anybody else either. The general consensus of opinion was, one, I was an idiot to have gone ashore with Paddy in the first place, and second, I should have just run for it. Like I said, no, I'm not afraid of heights. I probably should be, considering what Paddy did to me, but I'm not afraid of heights. I do, however, to this day, remain eternally suspicious of drunken Irish leading radio operators. So Hans, thanks for the question. I hope everybody enjoyed the answer. That's about all I really feel up to for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. As I said, I'm having a pretty nasty reaction to my COVID vaccination. So we're going to knock that one on the head. And I do hope you enjoyed it, short though it was. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.